we'll talk about this morning is really quite crucial to not just yoga or teaching yoga or this day, but rather really our life in general. It's a very, very important part of life because it is how yoga affects our everyday experience. It's easy to think that yoga is something that happens on your mat. You go to some studio, you start the class, you finish the class, you go out and forget all about it. And that is nice for a while until you realize it is indeed like rowing on a river against the stream and then being washed back as soon as you stop the practice for the rest of the day. So the yogis have been advising us to implement yoga in every moment of our lives, in every action that we perform, and that is called karma yoga. So we'll talk about what that exactly means, and first of all, let's look at the term karma. Karma comes from the root action, to act, to live, if you will, as life is nothing more than a sequence of actions that we perform. So karma yoga then would mean union through action. So it would put forth the idea that we can realize the ultimate, that we can find out the truth about ourselves and the universe through action itself. Not any specific action even, but action in general. And as often in yoga, it isn't so much about what you're doing, but rather how you're doing it. And that also brings up the question, why you're doing it. So before we can talk about karma yoga as a practice, let's look at the term karma a little bit more closely. So we all have actually some understanding of that Sanskrit term. So much so that it has entered the dictionaries of various languages. It's now really a household term. Everyone has some notion of what karma means. And usually our understanding is something like, what goes around comes around. It is somehow related to the effects of our actions. We have this foggy notion that whatever we do is somehow resulting in a certain reciprocated action by the universe. There seems to be a giving and taking. There seems to be some kind of repercussions for what we do in life. And the thing is, we don't really know how exactly that works. In fact, many of us are not entirely certain about this. We may have an intuition about karma being a real thing. But when we ask science, they would actually come up with some laws of nature that actually express what we think is karma pretty closely. Maybe you've heard of the third law of thermodynamics, which is saying that every action in the universe is met by an equal and opposite counter reaction. And that sounds an awful lot like karma, doesn't it? It's just that this physical law is not so easily observed. It doesn't actually match with our colloquial understanding of what karma means, because it describes something that happens on a subtle level, if you will, and not in the same sense as we speak of subtle energy, but it really has to do with how bodies move through space, for instance, so that every work that is done in the universe is indeed met by an equal and opposite force. Like when we move our arm, there is a movement in one way, but there is basically an opposing force in the opposite direction. But that isn't really what we understand as karma. It isn't just what happens when we move our arm. It is really more that we associate karma with morals, that we associate it with how we act in the world, and that whatever we do to each other is eventually coming back to us. So there is a bit of a discrepancy between our understanding of karma in an everyday sense and the physical law of thermodynamics. But what is really at the core of our understanding is that we seem to think good actions give us good results and bad actions give us bad results. Now, what could be wrong with that view? Have you ever noticed that there is potentially something wrong with that idea?
If you're doing something good because you want something good to be done to you in return, then maybe it's not the right reason that you're doing it. Do it because it's the right thing to do, not because you're going to get something out of it.
You're already taking a second step there. Now suppose you're doing something good. You go and give some money to a homeless person. You go and help someone do the dishes. What happens next? Does something good happen to you right away?
Probably not.
Yeah. So why is that? What's up with that?
Not to mention, with regard to Newton's law, an equal and opposite reaction would potentially be me doing something good and then giving money to a homeless person and then me getting punched in the face. It would be equal.
Because the person is drunk and somehow didn't realize what's going on and went into the end.
Oh my God.
That can happen, right? Yeah. And in fact, it happens a lot. So many times we're so proud of ourselves because we did something good, and the next thing you know, something bad happens. And vice versa, there's all these people doing all kinds of bad shit every day. And yet they're like rich and famous and wealthy, and like, something isn't quite right with karma. What's happening here with good and bad? And we may tell ourselves, well, eventually it will come around. It's only a question of time. And maybe that is true. But still, there is something really wrong in the kingdom of Denmark, as they say, at the core of karma, because the terms good and bad themselves don't really check out. Because when we look at something that is good for you, it might be bad for someone else. Or if it's something that is looking pretty bad right this moment, but then tomorrow we realize, oh, actually it was a good thing. Or we see something that looks pretty awesome, and then we find out some additional information and realize, oh, it's actually pretty bad. So this good and bad thing seems to be dependent on certain factors. There seem to be a multitude of factors, indeed, that are determining if something is good or bad, like the factor of subjectivity. What is good for us can be bad for someone else. Or the factor of time. What is good today can be bad tomorrow, or vice versa. Or then always the factor of information. How much do we know about a given situation? Maybe something that looks pretty good, someone might be giving a lot of money to charity. Looks awesome. Next thing you know, turns out it was some kind of tax move and they wanted to save money, and in the end it benefited them more than anyone. So we don't always have all the facts. We don't see clearly what really good and bad would mean on the ultimate level. And the more we try and look into this, we may realize maybe there is no such thing as good and bad on the ultimate level. Maybe those terms are simply labels that we attach based on our limited knowledge, which is time and space restricted, which is information restricted, and so forth. Which is, of course, depending on our perspective. Like, it is completely bad for a woman to not wear a headscarf in a Muslim country. But it's completely fine anywhere else. So there is even cultural constraints that are simply definitions, that are just some kind of agreement or a law perhaps even, that has been imposed by somebody, which then defines what is good and bad. It simply doesn't work like that. Good and bad are not universal constants. They are subject to factors beyond our control, beyond our knowledge. So what if karma, which seems to be a universal mechanism, is based on something that is not universal? That doesn't make sense. If this karmic reality of what goes around comes around has any kind of reality, it needs to be based on something that is indeed universal, that is not subject to interpretation, that is not subject to space and time and conditions that can change. So suppose for a moment karma is indeed a universal reality, just like the physical law of cause and effect is a reality that we can measure, that we can prove, and that has been proven many, many times. So if that is indeed a universal law, perhaps it is based on something else. And that is why we see disparity between what we expect and what we actually see in nature. Maybe there is something else at the core of karma that is not so obvious, but that is indeed universal. Could there be anything you can come up with that might be at the core of karma instead of good and bad? Yin and yang? No.
Every action either leads us to separation or union.
Who's to say?
You.
God. God. We just bring God into the picture.
Yeah.
At the core of karma is God. He has a long beard. Well, maybe not. Maybe yes, because everything is God. But let's leave God out of it for now, because we don't actually need Him here. Like often in yoga, when we try hard enough, we don't need God so much, because God is everything anyways. So what else could you imagine?
Intention?
Intention.
Sure.
That is actually what we often come up with when we think about it a little bit, because there's this example of, say, a robber who robs somebody in a little back street, and in the process, in the struggle, the victim gets killed by the knife. Very bad, right? We have a death. Now suppose there's a surgeon in the operating theater, and he operates on a patient, and something goes wrong, a wrong cut has been made, the patient dies. What has happened in both cases is more or less the same. A person got killed by a knife. But the difference is intention. In one case, there was harm. In the other case, there was a positive intention, an intention to heal. But things went out of hand. Things went wrong beyond our control. Whatever did control the situation made a different choice. So intention is in there somehow. But let's look more deeply, what exactly is that intention? Because as long as we say intention, we're still bound to say, okay, good intention, bad intention, and we're back to good and bad. It is an intention, but what exactly is it in our intention that determines the outcome karmically?
Proof?
Proof?
True?
Truth. Truth.
What is
How
truth?
so?
Huh?
What?
Yeah, also, what is truth?
What is truth? Yeah.
No hidden intention, just doing what? Purity?
But the thing is, our intention is also based on limited knowledge. We may have the best intentions and we're still causing harm, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
But what really is it that governs our intention? It's really hard to guess that one. I always have to actually, in the end,
It's conviction.
resolve it. Conviction?
It's conviction. It's conscious. It's like the energy that you feel is a reaction to a specific stimuli.
Yeah, that's in there somehow. So what it actually is, the yogis have found, is attachment and aversion. Because that is at the root of our intentions. That is at the root of what we then call positive and negative, good and evil. Every single thing we do in life, everything we've ever done, and a lot of what we will be keeping doing, is based on either wanting something or trying to avoid something. And that is a universal mechanism. Because this is not subject to interpretation. It's not subject to external factors. It is simply what motivates every single action in our lives. And we've mentioned it in the beginning, the game of pleasure and pain. Seeking pleasure, wanting pleasure, desiring pleasant experiences, and avoiding pain, rejecting unpleasant experiences. That is what motivates everything, what creates our intentions. So the robber had the attachment to the victim's money. The surgeon might have had an attachment to healing the person. We call that good. At the same time, he might have been after money as well. He might have been after fame. All kinds of other things might have been playing under the surface. So here we see more layers of the same action. The robber might have not seen any other option. Maybe he didn't look hard enough, fair enough. But the point really is that when we look hard enough, we can see in every single action we perform an intention of wanting or avoiding, and that is what comes back to us. Whenever there is a desire, when there is an attachment motivating an action, it creates an imbalance in the universe, and that is called a karmic bond. And when there is an avoidance, a rejection, an aversion motivating an action, it creates a karmic bond, an imbalance on the universal level. And the universe always wants to balance itself out. As a whole, it is balanced at all times. But individual aspects of it are coming out of balance and then back into balance. Everywhere, all the time, in an infinitely intricate system of karmic repercussions. And that is what plays out in our world, in our lives. Everything we do causes karmic repercussions because it's based on attachment or aversion. And conversely, everything that happens to us is the result of such an imbalance in the first place. So literally, what we do based on aversion or attachment creates a repercussion coming back to us. Maybe in a way we don't understand. Maybe the resolution of that imbalance isn't actually obvious to us. Something that's seemingly unrelated resolves that imbalance in our individual karmic space. Now, karma happens on different levels. We can speak of it as an individual reality. We, each and every one of us, have karmic baggage, if you will. You can think of it as a pile of karma. And often that is called good karma or bad karma. And we need to actually sweep that out as well. Because there is no such thing. There is no good and bad as ultimate truth. There is only imbalances, karmic bonds, based on an attachment or an aversion. It's not that attachments are good and aversions are bad, not at all. We've transcended good and bad and have found now two causes for karmic bonds that are both equally treacherous, because both of those bonds are keeping us in this reality, are keeping us in our limited existence as humans. Maybe you've been wondering, why is it that the Buddhists are talking about samsara, the cycle of birth and rebirth, as a negative thing? The Buddha is always quoted saying, life is suffering. And in the West, we often beg to differ, and we say, hey, it's actually pretty nice. I go to Guatemala, I take teacher training, everything is green, it rains a little bit, but in general, it's pretty sweet. So life doesn't seem to be so much suffering, is it? Well, maybe we live our life on the back of some poor Guatemalans who are making food for us downstairs. Well, that is maybe a little bit too direct as a connection, but you know what we're hinting at. There is a large part of the world that isn't as fortunate as us. There's people that have pretty miserable lives on a daily basis. And it's not even just others that are suffering and we're just lucky, but we have to consider that there is change in our lives. We've not always been in these fortunate circumstances. We've not always been super happy yogis in a paradise. We've sometimes gone through bad stuff, haven't we? And in those moments, life was indeed suffering. And chances are, there's more of that coming our way. It would be pretty naive to say, yeah, but this was all in the past. We're good now. We'll be fine forever after. Probably not. And there's actually 3 big causes for suffering that are coming our way, if we like it or not. Also coming out of Buddhism, they've been given thousands of years ago. Old age, sickness, and death. These 3 are not optional. Sooner or later, they will catch up with us. So when the Buddha says life is suffering, what he means is not every single moment is absolutely atrocious, but rather, sooner or later, life will become pretty freaking dark and difficult. And then we better are prepared. Then we better have some ideas of how to deal with that. Else we end up under the bus of life. So when we look at life as a temporary condition that is sometimes reasonably pleasant, but many other times not so great. And we all know how bad suffering can be. It can be pretty, really ridiculous. So, if that is a reality we're all facing, even if we like to kind of sweep it under the carpet for the time being, we understand why the Buddha says life is suffering. And in the next teaching of Buddhism, he says there is a way out. And the way out is given as practice. And the practice, if you look into the Buddhist scriptures or those of yoga, is nothing more than to resolve your karma. So here is another way of looking at how yogic practice works. We were saying yesterday, it can be seen as a path of purification. It can be seen as a path of energetic refinement through the chakras. It can be seen as a path of liberation. But that liberation raises the question of from what? And a simple answer would be from karma. We can say liberation from suffering or liberation from evil, liberation from limitations, fair enough. But all of that is nothing more than a different way of saying a liberation from karma. Yeah.
So karma is individual and shared.
Yeah, we'll get back to this. So on the individual level, our karma is a trace, can't remember the word, a leftover effect of a past attachment or aversion that is still in our system, and that will have to be resolved before we can transcend that existence of human suffering that is eventually in store for us. So the perspective goes beyond a single life. We may even manage, perhaps we're really lucky and we have a super fortunate life. We grow up with a golden spoon in our mouths, we're sheltered, we're kind of happy even, somehow, magically, and our entire life unfolds wonderfully. At the end of life, we're like, ha, nothing doing, no karma problem here. I've totally beat the system. Yeah, but then we're coming back and we're paying for all the attachment and all the aversion that will have been part of that life as well. Now that of course brings the question, is reincarnation even a thing? Not everyone just accepts that as a reality. It is a working theory for many people. We may have an intuitive feeling that there is something to it, just like with karma. But do we have proof? Well, we actually do. If you start looking, if you research reincarnation, you will find a staggering pile of strong indication for it. There are amazing cases out there where people remember their past lives. And of course we could say, well, I can also claim I remember some stuff. And what do they remember? They always remember they've been princes and princesses and kings and queens and something awesome in the Dalai Lama. They never remember they've been like a street sweeper or someone who picked through garbage in Guatemala City. They've always been something glamorous, right? That doesn't really check out. Yeah, well, but on the other hand, would you remember being a street sweeper? Maybe you would. But the point is not what people remember. The point is the case that there are cases that are actually verified. There is a very amazing example called by a psychologist called Brian Weiss. He wrote a book called Many Lives, Many Masters, and it's a very recommended book. And he describes how he is a very mainstream psychologist. He was simply working with people having various problems in their lives, and he wasn't really open-minded or spiritual or anything like that. Like a regular psychologist guy, mainstream scientific approach of psychology. And he ended up with a patient who under hypnosis recounted endless stories that he first dismissed as, you know, the stories you tell under hypnosis, maybe it's dreams, whatever it would be. But over time, he recognized more and more of those elements are very detailed, are very relevant, and are perhaps verifiable. And it seemed like they were memories of another time. So he started researching those memories that were given by the patient under hypnosis. And he found that many of the details that were given actually did check out and actually did belong to certain people of history. And he was very skeptical, and he didn't just believe it right away, of course. He got intrigued, he got curious, he's a scientist, he started really working with it over years. And eventually, after lots of work, he came to the conclusion, okay, this person is remembering other lives. She just does. And she does it in a way that is actually cathartic. She learns to overcome the karmic bonds that have been established in other lives. She releases herself from trauma that is still somehow stored in her system by working through it under hypnosis. And so he was able to have amazing results with this patient, and she got a lot better. And he was, of course, changed completely, having the carpet pulled out from under himself, because his entire idea of how the mind works, how life works, how the world works, was thrown up into the air. And he came to the conclusion that reincarnation is a thing. So this is one example. Read the book if you like. It's pretty interesting. Then there is, yeah?
We can take an example from physics with energy not being able to be created or destroyed. So what happened? It would be transferred into something else.
Well, now physics speaks of energy in certain terms, and yoga speaks of energy in different terms. So it's always a bit of a mismatch when we try to bring the two together. We can. Many things do come together, and there's very interesting things in the Tao of Physics, if you want to read that book. Fritjof Capra, I think is his name. Very interesting to see how he brought together ancient scriptures with physical findings of recent decades. And there is a lot of work done with quantum physics nowadays, which can be found to actually describe phenomena that are quite shocking to the mind. It basically, again, throws up into the air our idea of reality, and those very phenomena being described in ancient scriptures, where quantum mechanics was not exactly commonly known at the time. So the yogis have found certain structures of the universe to be real, to be reproducible, to be describable and reliable. And those structures are nowadays described in formulae by scientists. And we have theories that are confirming those ancient scriptures. So yeah, we can very well say that energy cannot be destroyed or created, as the universe is a closed system. At least physics sees it as that. And we have to consider that lots of modern Western science is by no means conclusive. They often find new things, check again 10 years later, and they say something different. That's because we just don't have it figured out all the way scientifically. But we're getting there. Slowly, slowly, more and more gets confirmed. So another example for reincarnation, we'd actually like to show you a little clip before the movie on Thursday, and that is about an 11-year-old boy who remembered a past life as a fighter pilot. Have you seen that one? Pretty fascinating. That boy has all kinds of memories and tells his parents, and eventually they get curious and they start researching, and they actually find out who he was in World War II. And he meets people that are still alive from the time, and he recognizes them by name, having never met them before. Yeah, it's fascinating. This is another case study, and you might call it anecdotal, which is a common way of dismissing evidence that is not necessarily to be generalized. Fair enough. But the thing is, if you start looking, you'll find so many examples that are supporting the idea, the reality of reincarnation. And so it is often really just religious dogma that is making us reject that idea. Christianity, for instance, is simply rejecting the notion, not happening. But has it always? If you start looking into the history of Christianity, you will find that the Bible has been edited many, many times in 2000 years. And there was one particular point in 300 AD, which is called the Council of Nicaea, where Emperor Constantine in Constantinople has edited out everything he didn't like from the Holy Scripture. And that included numerous references to reincarnation. None of this is 100% confirmed. This is a very long time ago. But if you start looking, there are actually reports from the Council of Nicaea. There is quite a lot to support this view. And there is quite a lot of stuff missing from the Bible. Like, say, what did Jesus do between age 12 and age 30? There is 18 years of nothing in the Bible. Maybe he went to India and got enlightened. And there is a book saying Jesus lived in India. Very interesting book to read. So, that aside as well. Open the mind, if you haven't yet, to the notion of reincarnation. Because it's very likely that that is how it goes. And there's actually more to it. We often think of reincarnation as a linear succession of lives. That seems to make sense. We die, we get reborn. We die, we get reborn. A cycle, if you will, of birth and rebirth, because we go through many lives and we can see that as a circle. But nonetheless, there is a temporal succession. As time goes on, we get reborn in the future. And that doesn't seem to be the case. There's actually cases where people remember past lives that are in the future. There's cases where time doesn't even seem to be so fixed anymore. And that is because time ultimately is a construct of the mind. It is somehow interrelated with space, as we know since Einstein. There is a lot that can be said about how fluent time is. Maybe it'd be good to add to yesterday's brief mention that the relativity of time, according to relativity, as according to Einstein, is not that you feel something to be different. Like if you're excited about something, time goes by fast. If you're bored, time goes by slowly. That is not what relativity means. That is just our perception being different. What relativity means is that time depends on velocity. If you were to accelerate yourself and move really, really fast through space, it would literally affect time. If you have a clock that moves very fast and a clock that moves not at all, the time on those two clocks would go at a different pace. Like literally, reproducibly, measurably. This is what relativity, or what one example of relativity would mean. So that gives us an idea that time is not chiseled in stone, that it isn't just fixed and given to go on eternally at a certain pace. No, it depends on various factors. So from the perspective of yoga, time is not so very real at all. Yoga actually says that it is a result of consciousness, that it is our mind that puts events into succession, into sequence. Just a way to make sense of reality, to create our notion of existence. Everything that happens to us is put into a sequence of events, and we perceive that as time. It's created by consciousness itself. And there is a big question remaining now that we'll look into more in the coming days of what consciousness even is. How can it create something like time? What can we say about consciousness? What are the limits of it? Are there any? So there's many interesting questions to consider. But when it comes to reincarnation, we'd like to suggest a different idea of it, which is not linear, but which is universal. Suppose for a moment that the idea of yoga means oneness, means union between all things. That includes all beings, all events, all times, all places in space. All of that is one. Consciousness, as we perceive it individually, is perhaps not separate, but is also one. So the individual consciousness in each of us appears to be separate as far as we are concerned. At our level of consciousness, we see it as separate. Ultimately, it is all one consciousness. And every single incarnation, every individual being is just an expression of it, but is part of that oneness consciousness. So when we speak of reincarnation, what about the idea that every single individual is an incarnation of that one consciousness, and in this way we are incarnations of each other? So that means it doesn't have to be in the future or in the past. I'm living this particular life as Arjuna right now. Eventually I die. I will live a different life. Maybe I'll be you, or I'll be you. And I'll go through existence as one of you. Then I die, and I'll be somebody else. I die, I'll be somebody else. I will be everybody. I am everybody. We all are everybody. So that means karma in this way appears to be individual at our level of consciousness. As we transcend that, we recognize that karma is universal. So whatever we do to another, we literally do to ourselves. It doesn't have to come back at some later time. If I do harm to another, I am that other. I'm doing harm to myself already. So there is the karma balancing itself. But it takes time for me to incarnate as the other person in order to feel that effect. And it isn't even really time. It is really more a shift in frequency, if you will. Because we're all here at the same time. So reincarnation, ultimately, is for everyone all together. And to fully understand it with the mind will be difficult. Our mind is ultimately a limited tool. And the mind will even argue with this and come up with ideas that there might be something wrong about this. But ultimately, the scriptures have told us of all traditions. It's all one. It's not that there is some little footnote saying, except you, you're different from everything else. No, it's all one. So in this way, karma is a universal reality in an infinitely intricate network of cause and effect. Everything balances itself out constantly. And what we can do is to take charge of the pile of karma that we are constantly accumulating. So far in this life, and many others, we have just accumulated more and more karma by acting upon desires and aversions. We've basically created a huge amount of baggage that keeps us in the limitations of consciousness as an individual. And if we want to break free from this, we're going to have to resolve that individual karma. This is a model. Like everything in physics, for instance, is a model as well. There's limitations to every model. but it's useful to use models to illustrate a point. So, from our perspective, there's individual karma. In order to break free from this, we have to resolve that karma. How can we possibly resolve karma? First of all, it's resolved all the time. Because everything that happens to us is resolving karma. But there might be more or less an equal amount of karma being created and resolved, and maybe slightly more being created, maybe not. Depending on how we live, we will have a pile of karma that is perhaps growing, perhaps not so much, but that is not really going anywhere. And the solution of taking karma away is to first of all stop producing it. Because if it is resolved all the time, if it is reduced all the time, by simply not producing more, we see mathematically, eventually we'll run out. Awesome, mission accomplished. Now how do we not produce more karma? We would have to act in a way that doesn't follow any desires or aversions. And that is not an easy thing to do. We would have to act in a way that is detached, that is unafraid. We're not looking for any particular result because we don't even know what that will get us, except for the fact that it will definitely get us a karmic repercussion. And we're not trying to avoid anything anymore out of fear that it couldn't be pleasant, because that would also create karmic repercussions. So there is one particular scripture that is dealing with how to live without karma, or rather without creating karma. Which scripture is that? Anyone know? It's very well known. Maybe the most prominent scripture out of India. The Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavad Gita means Song of God. There he is again. God keeps coming back. What to do? It is called Song of God because it is a book about a conversation with God. There are these modern conversations with God. They're quite inspiring too. But yeah, back to the Bhagavad Gita. The conversation with God there happens with Krishna specifically. And the person conversing with Krishna is who? A character by the name of Arjuna. So that's where the name comes from. So he is a warrior. He's born in the warrior caste. So his job is be warrior. And it's set in an environment of war. We have a situation where there is an enemy party, and that enemy party, called the Pandavas, is creating a lot of suffering for the people. Someone has to do something. Arjuna is the warrior at hand. He needs to go and fight the Pandavas. Except that some of the Pandavas are his relatives. And some of the Pandavas are even his teachers. And it goes against every grain of Indian culture to fight your family, or let alone your teachers. It's just something you don't do. Even in the West, we kind of understand, right? You just don't do that. So he is in a dilemma. And that is what the book opens with. The despondency of Arjuna. He just doesn't know what to do. He has to fight the bad guys, but there are his family and his teachers as well. What is he going to do? And in his despair, he calls upon the divine. He prays to Lord Krishna. And as the story goes, Lord Krishna appears. And Krishna actually offers himself to one of the parties and his army to the other party. The Pandavas are quick to choose his army. So Arjuna ends up with Krishna. And so you can see these depictions sometimes. It's usually a scene of like a battle, what are they called? A chariot. A chariot with Arjuna in the back, being the warrior, and Krishna, his charioteer, who basically handles the horses. And that's the depiction you see a lot in Hindu iconography. So the main part of the Gita is now the evening before the battle, where Arjuna and Krishna are conversing about what he should do, about how we should live our life at large. Because his individual situation is only a symbol, a representation of our everyday dilemma between good and evil, between attachments and aversions. How should we live? How should we act? And because that is so relevant for every single person, and not just some remote yogi in a cave, but for everyone, this text has become so super prominent. Everyone in India knows it. All the children studied in school, at least the Hindu children. And it becomes a companion for many people through life, because Krishna gives some very valuable lessons in this text. And he first of all explains to Arjuna how it goes with desire and aversion, how it works with karma. So he illustrates to him that if he were to fight as an act of aversion against the Pandavas, that would create very intense karma. Now karma happens on different levels. Little side excursion here. If you have a thought of desire or aversion, that creates karma of a gentle kind, of a subtle kind. It has been compared to a line drawn on water. So just the desire in your mind or in your thoughts is so subtle that it is very quickly resolved. Now suppose the thought stays with you and you end up expressing it. You speak a thought based on attachment or aversion. That is stronger karma, more resilient karma, that has been described as a line drawn in sand. It'll go away pretty soon, but it's there for a while. So, a little grosser, a little stronger. Suppose you take it one step further and actually act upon it. You had some attachment, some aversion in your mind, you want to kill someone, you want to steal something, whatever it is. You express it to somebody, maybe an accomplice of some kind. Okay. You decide it should be done. You go ahead, you take action. That is karma of the greater order that is now really heavy and that is compared to a line chiseled in stone. It isn't eternal. Even a line in stone eventually withers away, but it can take a long time. So karma is not made all the same. There is subtle karma, there is intense karma. And it expresses itself in various forms. You probably know, everyone who has ever, for instance, killed another being is usually tormented for the rest of their life with by their conscience. So that is also an expression of very heavy karma. If you've stolen something, chances are it'll actually haunt you for a while at least. Gentler perhaps, but it's still present with you. You have taken action. So in this way, karma has different intensities. And for Arjuna, it's about killing. He's supposed to go and kill a whole bunch of people. So he's definitely concerned. And Krishna is telling him, well, ultimately, there is a way to act in the world that is not limited by desire and aversion, but that is given by a higher source, that is given from a higher place of consciousness, if you will. And we can see that as intuition. Whenever we get guided by intuition, what is suggested to us, wherever it may come from, is not based on desire or aversion. It comes from somewhere else, doesn't it? And if we ever act upon intuition, we usually find a beneficial outcome. Not just for us, but in general. Maybe we even find an outcome that is somewhat painful to us, but beneficial in a grander scale of things. Our intuition often tells us to do something that doesn't sound so great, that we don't really want to do, and that we don't end up doing, only to realize later that would have actually resolved the situation in the best possible way. So, without mentioning the word intuition specifically, Krishna describes to Arjuna that he needs to change his counsel, that he needs to change his basis of decision, his motivations, and he needs to act henceforth from the higher source, the inner guru, if you will, the divine inspiration, or intuition, if you'd like to call it that. As we follow intuitive knowledge, we are not subject to karmic repercussions, because we are not subject to the limitations of the ego. We're not making decisions based on desires and aversions anymore. In order for Arjuna to understand this, Krishna took the special step of showing himself in his big form, as it is described. So he basically allows Arjuna to glimpse the universal reality. And that is what it often takes. To really become established in Karma Yoga, in acting without desires and aversions, we need to make some steps, we need to make some insights. But amazingly, Karma Yoga in itself also provides that for us. Many teachers have recommended to act selflessly, to perform selfless service, to go and work in a hospice, to go and live in an ashram for a while and wash plates every day, to go and help old people in some form, in some old people's home perhaps. And everyone you could speak to, having done anything like that, will probably tell you that there is something magical happening if you engage in selfless service. Many people have actually found it to be the most fulfilling activity in life. It may not make you rich, it probably doesn't. It may not get you famous, hopefully it doesn't. But it does make you very fulfilled. So many of us feel an urge to be social workers, for instance, or to be yoga teachers, for instance. I mean, someone might be like, oh, I heard there's good money in yoga, I'll be a yoga teacher. Yeah. But many others, hopefully all of you, are like, well, I could do some stupid job, but I could also study spirituality and spread love and light in this form to other beings. What better service could I do to humanity than that? Maybe I have the Dharma to do that. The term Dharma is pretty big both in yoga and Buddhism. It describes our there's so many English words that don't really capture it. You might want to say destiny, and it's not really it. Because destiny has this idea of what's going to happen anyways. And while Dharma eventually does happen anyways, we can resist for a long time. So maybe a better term is law, in the sense that it is something that unfolds, something that is supposed to happen. Maybe it is your Dharma to become a yoga teacher. Maybe your fate, perhaps, is a good term, yeah. Maybe you finish the course, but then you get offered some really fancy, well-paid job and you decide to take it and you become some kind of manager. And a part of you will always look back, was that a good decision? Or maybe you'll be happy ever after. Who knows? It might be your Dharma to be a great manager, to come into some position where you can actually do a lot of good for the people, where you can do a lot of beneficial action that is not based on desire or aversion. So you don't have to be a yoga teacher, you don't have to be anything in particular to perform karma yoga. Instead, the idea is to act from a selfless place of service no matter what you do. You could be a bus driver and you just do the very best of you as a bus driver, never harming anyone in the process, taking people to where they need to go, where they actually can fulfill their Dharma. Or you can find yourself on a battlefield, having to perform actions that are pretty much gruesome, having to kill, because it is your Dharma. And that is what Arjuna had to do. He had to recognize that in this situation, his Dharma, his duty, is to fight this battle, is to kill, because it will resolve a lot of suffering in the world to so many people. But the question is attitude. Are you fighting on a battlefield out of hate, out of aversion to your enemy? Are you creating a huge amount of karma in the process? Or are you recognizing your position? Is Arjuna able to recognize his duty on this battlefield as the one who resolves, who alleviates, who relieves the suffering of all those victims of the Pandavas? And if he can recognize this duty, can he fight and kill without aversion, without creating karma? Of course, that is ridiculously difficult. But is it impossible? It can be done. And obviously, most everyone's situation will not nearly be as intense as Arjuna's. We just have to live our lives in this world as people, without being guided constantly by aversion and attachment. And yet, it is still pretty difficult on a daily basis, because it creeps in from all sides, all the time. And that is why people take positions as karma yogis. To do this in everyday life is super difficult because you're constantly bombarded with things that you are made to desire, that you are made to fear. So in everyday life in the world, it is super hard to practice karma yoga. So you need to practice. What do you do to practice? You go into an environment where it is safe to do it, where you are not constantly tempted, or at least not as much, by desires, where you are not surrounded by potential fears. So people have joined monasteries for that purpose. People have joined ashrams for that purpose. And have performed selfless action not for anything that they personally want, but because they see a greater truth in their actions there, a greater benefit. They see the opportunity that working for a place like that allows them to benefit others' spiritual growth. And maybe through something very simple. Maybe by cleaning the toilets. Maybe by cooking food or washing plates. Maybe by growing food. Maybe by fixing and building stuff. Whatever it is that needs to be done in an ashram is not done for the individual's sake. It's not done because you have a desire to do it. Not at all. You do it because it needs to be done. The place has the purpose of uplifting people's consciousness. Any monastery has that purpose. Any temple should have that purpose. Any ashram has that purpose. This ashram has that its purpose. To elevate people's consciousness. And in order to achieve this, there is daily needs, there's daily duties to be performed by somebody. So you take it upon yourself to sign up for karma yoga because it isn't something that tempts your desires and aversions. It is benefiting a greater purpose. It is benefiting other people's spiritual evolution. And in the process, you find yourself performing actions every day that are not based on what you want or what you fear. Ideally, you would do everything you do for just one single reason, and that is, it needs to be done. The toilet is gross, someone needs to clean it. And you don't walk around saying, I'm going to go clean the toilet now, see how I'm doing this? I'm awesome, I'm a karma yogi. That would be beside the point. That would be missing the point altogether. Because there you are attached to some kind of self-image of being awesome, of being more spiritual. So it's very treacherous to do this. You don't really want to do it in a public place where everybody sees your t-shirt saying Karma Yogi of the Year. You want to basically do it quietly, maybe even secretly. You see something needs doing, and instead of making any kind of fuss, you simply do it. And you do it because it needs to be done, and it is an action that is done without creating an equal and opposite reaction, without creating a karmic repercussion. In this moment, you have rebalanced the universe a tiny little bit. Because what may happen to you next is resolving karma, but you haven't produced any. So over time, your pile of karma reduces. And that is why karma yoga is called a practice of purification. You purify your individual self from karmic repercussions by acting without creating any karma. Yoga has found specific actions that can accelerate the resolution of karma. Karma is associated with Ajna chakra, with the third eye. So any practice on Ajna chakra is actually specifically aimed at the resolution of karma as well. So you can use yogic techniques, tantric techniques, to accelerate this process. And if you're in the right kind of environment, you can combine this. You live a life that doesn't produce any karma, and you use techniques that are resolving your karma at an accelerated pace. In conjunction between the two, within this lifetime, liberation is reached. It isn't necessary to perform the yogic techniques. There are many ashrams out there that don't teach anything else. Well, actually, they don't teach anything at all. All they do is give a space for karma yoga. There is a famous ashram in Hyderabad that was found in the 80s. And the teacher there, who is supposedly an incarnation of a 300-year-old master called Babaji, and that teacher was actually guiding everyone at the ashram to do just karma yoga. They would cook, they would clean, they would fix, they would just live there. And there were no teachings given. There were no other practices performed than that. The simple purification by selfless service was the practice of the ashram. Nothing else needed. And it's not the only place like this. There's many karma yoga ashrams where there is no teacher even, where there is just a bunch of practitioners leading from day to day their lives, giving others an opportunity to come there, perhaps retreat for a while, doing also karma yoga in the process. So the idea of practicing karma yoga is that you go into an environment where you can safely practice first, because that's where it's easier. And you learn how to really be selfless, how to really just do what it takes, and to see what happens in the process, how magic unfolds, how you feel uplifted, relieved, free, by just acting selflessly every day. And from that experience, you go into the world and do the same, after you know how. So it takes this apprenticeship, if you will. Because to just start in the world is really very difficult. So that is why we recommend to every one of you to practice karma yoga somewhere. There is so many projects in the world that need help. If you just start looking, you'll be overwhelmed with opportunities where you can just go and help, with expecting nothing in return. If it is some kind of work exchange, that's not counting really. That doesn't work. You're not just going somewhere volunteering and in exchange you get something. You get, I don't know, some free course or accommodation or food or something. If it's a deal like that, and you find yourself going there because you get something, that undermines the spirit of karma yoga. And unfortunately, we do that. We accommodate karma yogas. We feed karma yogis because at first, that's kind of what's expected. We would have a very hard time explaining this properly and making it clear that the true idea of karma yoga involves expecting nothing in return. There's places where you can do karma yoga and you pay for it. And there's lots and lots of people making fun of it and saying, oh, these idiots, they're going somewhere and pay to work and they pay for it. It's the immediate reaction of the mind. That makes no sense. You go somewhere to work and you pay for it? Wait a second. No way. So it doesn't happen. So what we decided to do is we offer accommodation and food, but not as an exchange. We offer it to facilitate the karma yoga practice. We basically take your worldly needs out of the picture. You don't have to pay a rent. You don't have to buy food. Don't worry about it. Come and just do selfless service. Without having a worry in the world, without having to worry how you're going to make a living, because you don't need to. In this moment, your life is taken care of. The worldly needs are out of the picture and you can focus on this practice only. It is not easy to explain this properly, and that is why we have invited the karma yogis to come up today. It takes all this introduction of even understanding karma in the first place. But once we've made all these steps, we understand the practice better. And we recognize, okay, I'm not a volunteer. I'm not a work exchanger. I'm a karma yogi. I do what needs to be done. Everything else is irrelevant. And I see what the results are every day within myself. Being more balanced, being more in touch with my inner essence, coming in touch with my intuition more and more. Feeling clearly what is the next step in my life, perhaps. What do I need to do? Not based on the limitations of the ego, telling me, oh, you should do this, you'll get that out of it, but from a deeper place, where you feel, oh, my dharma is to do snow clearing in Alaska. Someone's got to do it. People don't get to work if the snow is not cleared. Silly example, it can be anything, just that's the point. Perhaps we come to the conclusion, wow, my dharma is to share yoga. My dharma is to share meditation with the world. There's tons of people doing it these days because more and more people recognize that that is something that needs to be done. And of course it gets tainted somewhat by becoming a billion-dollar industry. And there's lots of factors in this that are not so beautiful. And there's scandals. And there's all kinds of things going wrong. Nonetheless, there's also a lot of consciousness being elevated. There's a lot of aspects, parts of it, where it does work. Where people do find happiness. Where people do find liberation. To some degree, at least. It's a long way to go. It's a lot of karma to resolve. But with patience, with dedication, we can resolve every single trace of karma that is left. We shouldn't be impatient at all because it won't be happening by tomorrow midday. It'll take decades probably. But it's decades spent in a fulfilling life of sharing with others, of helping others, which are ourselves, which are us in a different incarnation. So make no mistake, you can overshoot the goal. Like you walk down the street and there's grandma trying to pass the street, to cross the street. And you're like, oh, this needs to be done. And you have somewhere important to go, but you're like, no, I'm going to help Granny. And you take Granny and you help her across the street and a big bus comes and kills the both of you. What happened now? Were you really in touch with your higher self? Did you just act upon some impulse, perhaps? Was there some programming? Was there some... Did you actually stop for a moment and consider if that is what needs to be done? Maybe Granny didn't even want to cross the street in the first place. Maybe you didn't see that the light was red. Maybe you just should have waited and checked. Maybe you were so much in a rush that you didn't see the bus. So what we suggest is also a specific tool. A tool that is called consecration. And consecration is to actually take a moment of meditation about every action you perform. Basically, an opportunity to check in with your higher self if what you are about to do is what needs to be done, or if it is coming from the ego that you think this is the best idea. So how does consecration work? A consecration is basically a little ritual, but not an empty ritual. A lot of rituals have become empty. When we speak a prayer, if we say grace before our food, hopefully this is an actual prayer, a dynamic availability of the heart, a moment where we can be filled with the highest good, rather than just repeating some phrases that we think we're supposed to repeat, hoping that something good comes of it. So a consecration in this way is a ritual, but a ritual in the true sense of the word. A powerful adjustment of reality. So you basically take a moment before acting and you check in with your intuition. You elevate your awareness for a moment. It helps to close your eyes, to just feel into yourself. And you can even ask the question literally, is this what needs to be done? Is this in line with my higher spirit, with my higher self, with my truth? Am I on the right path right now? And you just listen. There's 2 steps to this. You ask, you inquire genuinely, and you listen. And don't expect someone to say, yes, go ahead, it's okay. It's not like that. It's rather an intuitive knowledge. And at first it may not be there. You may ask yourself 100 times and there is no answer that you can make out, that you can perceive really. But that is because you've just started. It is basically requiring your intuition to become sharper, to become clearer. And that happens by simply practicing it. You can work on Vishuddha Chakra, activating your intuition. It'll help. You can also you can use tricks. Like one trick for tweaking your intuition is you can throw a coin. Mm-hmm. You throw a coin and you catch it, you put it on your other hand, but you don't look at it. It doesn't matter what the coin says. The trick works in the way that while you throw the coin, in yourself there is some kind of hope. There is some kind of potential outcome, a decision that appears there in your consciousness. that is probably your intuition. So what the coin says is irrelevant, but it is like an amplifier for your intuition, what you should do in this case. We're not saying this is a reliable trick that always works, right? It is very possible that your ego hijacks that and is just screaming, do it, you're going to be rich. That is possible. But we found it useful. We found it working more often than not. So experiment if it works for you. Maybe you have a better trick in mind. If anyone has an idea, definitely we're open. But take a moment, especially for the big decisions in life. You want to go on a journey? Check in with your higher self. Consecrate the journey. You can use a phrase like, I consecrate this journey to the highest good. And if that feels aligned, the words will come easy. You will feel in tune. While if it feels there is some kind of resistance, I consecrate it. Yeah, I consecrate this, right? I do. Something might not be so aligned. If you can, as you consecrate an action, verbally or mentally, you feel if it flows or if there is resistance. Another trick you can use. You can dedicate the outcome of your actions to the higher good. That is why we do it every morning and every afternoon before we start practice. Because it is also something that should apply to your practice. You shouldn't step on your yoga mat because you want to have a more muscular body. I mean, ultimately there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't do any harm. If that's your motivation for yoga, fair enough. But is it good enough? Could you perhaps go higher, aim higher than that? So when we perform spiritual practice, it helps to consecrate it so that we come into a space that is not attached to a certain outcome. Even if you think that outcome is, I want to be the greatest yoga teacher so that I can help so many other people. That may still come from some kind of egoic desire for success. Your consecration when you do practice is an act of surrender, is an act of letting go. The practice is not going to do any harm, of course, but is it done with the right attitude? Are you trying to force a certain outcome? Are you trying to reach a certain goal? Or are you completely open for your heart to blossom? Are you completely ready to accept whatever may unfold in your practice, even if it's not so nice? You might end up like a crying mess after a few asanas. Should you not have done it? Of course you should have done it. It isn't so pleasant, but that was a necessary stage in this particular moment. And effects like this can only happen if we have the right attitude to our practice. So before we practice yoga or anything, before we go on a journey, before we even say anything, consecrate. Check in with your higher self. Is that the right path of action?